The gun pressed against Marcus "Ghost" Williams's temple, and for the first time in 20 years of protecting Bumpy Johnson, his hand didn't shake. 3 feet away, kneeling on the warehouse floor with his hands tied behind his back, was the man Ghost had called brother for a decade, Jerome "Silk" Patterson, Bumpy's most trusted lieutenant, his childhood friend, the godfather to his daughter. The wire recorder hidden in Silk's jacket was still running, capturing every word, sending it directly to the FBI. Ghost's finger tightened on the trigger. The next sound would either save Harlem's independence or destroy everything Bumpy had built. Drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from? Here's a question that'll tear this section apart. If your best friend betrayed everything you stood for, could you pull the trigger yourself, or would you let someone else do it? Hit subscribe because we're revealing the story that's been buried for 60 years. The night Bumpy Johnson's inner circle shattered, when loyalty meant murder, and one bodyguard had to choose between friendship and survival. This isn't about gang violence. This is about the moment when organized crime's code of silence demanded the ultimate price, and only one man was cold enough to collect. June 15, 1963. The warehouse on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue had been Bumpy Johnson's emergency meeting location for years. Neutral ground, soundproof walls, one entrance that could be watched from 3 different positions. Tonight it was serving a different purpose. Interrogation room for a suspected traitor. Marcus "Ghost" Williams had earned his nickname not from stealth, but from his ability to remain invisible in any room, to blend into backgrounds, to be present without being noticed. For 20 years he'd been Bumpy Johnson's shadow, the bodyguard who never spoke unless spoken to, who never questioned orders, who moved through Harlem like smoke, lethal and silent. Tonight, Ghost wished he could disappear for real, because the man kneeling in front of him, bound and bleeding from a split lip, where one of Bumpy's enforcers had struck him, was Jerome "Silk" Patterson. And Jerome wasn't just another soldier in Bumpy's organization, he was Ghost's best friend since childhood, the man who'd stood beside him at his wedding, who'd held Ghost's daughter when she was born, who knew every secret Ghost had ever kept. Bumpy Johnson stood against the far wall, his face an unreadable mask. At 63, he'd survived 3 decades in Harlem's underworld by being smarter than his enemies and more ruthless than his allies. Tonight, he was both. "Show him the evidence," Bumpy said quietly. One of the other men in the room, Eddie "Knuckles" Morrison, Bumpy's enforcer, stepped forward and dropped a small device on the floor in front of Silk. It was a wire recorder, state-of-the-art FBI equipment, compact enough to hide in a jacket lining, but sophisticated enough to capture crystal-clear audio. "We found it sewn into his jacket," Knuckles said. "Been there for at least 3 months, maybe longer. Every conversation, every meeting, every piece of business, all of it recorded and transmitted to the feds." Ghost felt his stomach drop. 3 months. That meant Silk had been wearing a wire during the meeting with Carlo Gambino's representatives, during the negotiations with the Colombo family, during discussions about which cops were on the payroll and which judges could be bought. Everything. The FBI had everything. Silk looked up, his eyes meeting Ghost's. "Marcus, brother, you have to believe me." "Don't," Ghost said, his voice flat and cold. "Don't say my name. Don't call me brother. You lost that right the moment you put that wire on." "They had me, Ghost. They arrested my sister on drug charges, planted evidence completely fabricated. They said they'd put her away for 20 years unless I cooperated. What was I supposed to do? Let her rot in prison for something she didn't do?" It was the kind of story that would have worked on most people. Family loyalty, impossible choices, the FBI's dirty tactics. But Ghost had been in this world too long to accept easy explanations. "When did they arrest her?" Ghost asked. Silk hesitated. 4 months ago." "And when did you start wearing the wire?" 3 months ago. I tried to fight it, tried to find another way." "Stop lying." Bumpy's voice cut through the warehouse like a blade. He pushed off from the wall and walked slowly toward Silk, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. "We checked. Your sister was arrested 6 months ago, not 4. And the charges were dropped 5 months ago, a full month before you started recording us. So what's the real story, Silk? What did they really offer you? Silk's face crumbled. The defiant expression, the righteous justification, all of it collapsed into something uglier, fear mixed with greed. Witness protection, Silk whispered. Complete immunity, new identity, $50,000 cash to start over. They said I could bring my family, get out of Harlem, start a clean life. There it was, not coercion, not impossible choices, just ambition and betrayal dressed up as necessity. Ghost felt something inside him go cold and hard. He'd known Silk for 32 years. They'd grown up on the same block, stolen apples from the same fruit stand, shared their first cigarette behind the same abandoned building. Ghost had been the best man at Silk's wedding. Silk had been at Ghost's side when Ghost's son died of pneumonia, because the white hospital wouldn't treat a black child, and the black hospital didn't have the medicine. They'd survived poverty, racism, violence, and the constant pressure of life in a world that told them they were worth nothing. And through it all, Ghost had believed in one fundamental truth. You could trust your brothers. You could depend on the people who'd been there from the beginning. That belief had just been shattered like glass. How much did you give them? Bumpy asked, his voice still calm, still controlled. But Ghost could see the rage simmering underneath, the kind of rage that came from betrayal by someone you'd trusted with your life. Everything, Silk said, and there was something like relief in his voice now, like confession was a release. The gambling operations, the policy banks, the names of every cop and politician on payroll, the connections to the Italian families, the money laundering through legitimate businesses, all of it. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if Silk had just confirmed a business transaction rather than confessing to treason that could destroy everything Bumpy had built over 3 decades. Ghost, Bumpy said quietly, give me your piece. Ghost reached into his shoulder holster and pulled out his .38 Special, the same gun he'd carried for 15 years, the same gun that had saved Bumpy's life on 3 separate occasions. He checked that it was loaded, thumbed the safety off and handed it to Bumpy. But Bumpy didn't take it. Instead, he shook his head. Not for me. For you. Ghost understood immediately. This wasn't about Bumpy pulling the trigger. This was about Ghost doing it. This was about proving where his loyalty lay when friendship and duty collided. This was about whether Ghost was strong enough to execute his own best friend, or whether Bumpy needed to question Ghost's reliability too. It was a test, and failure meant joining Silk on the floor. Ghost took the gun, felt its familiar weight, and walked toward Silk. The other men in the warehouse, Knuckles, Raymond, Marcus's cousin Terrell, all stepped back, giving Ghost space for what came next. Silk looked up at Ghost, tears streaming down his face now. Marcus, please, we're brothers. Think about all we've been through together. Think about your daughter. I'm her godfather. You can't do this. Ghost pressed the barrel of the gun against Silk's temple. His hand was steady. His breathing was calm. He felt nothing but cold certainty. My daughter, Ghost said quietly, would have grown up without a father if your recordings had gotten Bumpy arrested and our organization destroyed. Every family in Harlem that depends on Bumpy's protection would have been left to the wolves. You didn't just betray Bumpy. You betrayed everyone. Ghost, please. Stop talking. Ghost's finger moved to the trigger. In that moment, frozen in time, he thought about all the things that had led to this point, the friendship that had defined half his life, the code that demanded absolute loyalty, the organization that had given him purpose and identity, the daughter whose future depended on Harlem remaining under Bumpy's control rather than being carved up by Italian families or corrupt police. And he thought about the sound that was about to echo through this warehouse, a sound that would change everything, that would mark the moment when Ghost Williams stopped being Marcus and became something harder, colder, more necessary. The sound that would tell every person in Bumpy Johnson's organization exactly what happened to traitors, no matter how close they'd once been. Ghost pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse like thunder, the sound so loud in the enclosed space that Ghost's ears rang for a full minute afterward. Silk's body slumped sideways, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes still open in an expression of disbelief, as if even at the end he hadn't believed Ghost would actually do it. Ghost stood there for a moment, the gun still in his hand, looking down at the man who'd been his brother. He felt nothing. No grief, no guilt, no satisfaction. Just emptiness where 32 years of friendship used to live. Bumpy walked over and placed a hand on Ghost's shoulder. "Clean this up," he said to the other men. "Make it look like the Italians did it. Dump the body in Genovese territory and spread the word. Silk Patterson was caught working with the mob against us. Bumpy Johnson doesn't forgive traitors, but he protects his own from outside threats." It was brilliant misdirection. Instead of admitting they had an FBI informant in their ranks, which would make the organization look weak and vulnerable, they'd claim Silk was working with the Italian families. It would reinforce Bumpy's image as a protector of Harlem, while making the Italians look like they were trying to infiltrate and destroy black operations. The other men moved quickly, wrapping Silk's body in a tarp, cleaning the blood, erasing evidence. Within 20 minutes, it was as if nothing had happened in that warehouse. Ghost handed the gun back to Bumpy, but Bumpy shook his head. "Keep it. You earned it tonight." They walked out of the warehouse together, into the Harlem night. The streets were alive with activity, people laughing outside nightclubs, vendors selling food from carts, music spilling out of open windows. Normal life, continuing despite the violence that had just occurred blocks away. "You did the right thing," Bumpy said as they walked. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did." "Did I?" Ghost's voice was hollow. "Or did I just prove I'm as much a killer as the people we're supposed to be protecting Harlem from?" Bumpy stopped walking and turned to face Ghost directly. "You want to know the difference between us and them? The mob kills for profit and power. The police kill because the system protects them. We kill to protect our community from both. Silk's betrayal would have destroyed everything, gotten me arrested, fractured our organization, left Harlem vulnerable to takeover by families that would bleed this community dry. So we're the good guys." Ghost couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. "We're the necessary guys. There's a difference." They walked in silence for another block before Bumpy spoke again. "The FBI is going to come looking for Silk. When they do, they're going to realize their informant is dead, and they're going to know we found him. That means they'll be watching all of us even more closely. Can you handle that?" Ghost thought about his daughter, about the future he was trying to build for her, in a world that wanted to crush people who looked like them. He thought about the decision he'd just made, the line he'd just crossed, the man he'd just killed. "I can handle it," Ghost said. And he meant it. What Ghost didn't know, what nobody in Bumpy's organization knew, was that Silk Patterson hadn't been the only informant. The FBI had learned from past failures and had cultivated a backup source, someone even closer to Bumpy's inner circle, someone who'd witnessed everything that happened in that warehouse tonight and was already planning how to use that information. The real traitor was still active, still recording, still feeding information to the FBI. And when that person's identity was finally revealed, it would make Silk's betrayal look like a minor inconvenience. But that revelation was still months away. Tonight, Ghost Williams walked through Harlem carrying the weight of murder and the cold certainty that he'd do it again if necessary. Because in Bumpy Johnson's world, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced at gunpoint. And the sound of that enforcement echoed through the streets, a warning to anyone who might consider betrayal. This is what happens when you break the code. This is the price of treachery. This is why you don't cross Bumpy Johnson. Ghost arrived home at 3 a.m. to find his daughter Maya still awake, reading a book in the living room. She was 14, sharp as a blade, with her mother's eyes and Ghost's quiet intensity. "You're home late," Maya said, not looking up from her book. "Work ran long." "You smell like gunpowder." Ghost froze. His daughter was too perceptive for her own good, a trait that would either save her or destroy her in the world she was growing up in. "It's Harlem, baby girl. Everybody smells like something." Maya finally looked up, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made Ghost uncomfortable. "Uncle Silk came by earlier, looking for you. He seemed scared." Ghost's blood went cold. "When?" "Around 8. He asked if I knew where you were, said it was important. I told him you were working. He left, said he'd find you later." She paused. "Is he okay?" Ghost had killed Silk around 10 p.m., which meant Silk had come looking for him 2 hours before the execution, probably trying to warn him, probably hoping their friendship meant something after all. The realization hit Ghost like a physical blow. Silk had chosen to approach him first, before running, before disappearing into witness protection. He'd chosen friendship over survival, and Ghost had repaid that choice with a bullet. "Dad?" Maya's voice cut through his thoughts. "Is Uncle Silk okay?" "Go to bed, Maya." "Dad? I said go to bed." Ghost's voice came out harder than he'd intended, sharp with guilt and rage and grief he couldn't afford to feel. Maya flinched, then stood and walked toward her bedroom, but at the doorway she paused and turned back. "Whatever happened tonight," she said quietly, "I hope it was worth it." Then she was gone, leaving Ghost alone in the living room with the .38 Special still tucked in his shoulder holster and the weight of his daughter's judgment crushing down on him. Ghost sat in the darkness for hours, replaying the moment over and over, the look in Silk's eyes, the sound of the gunshot, the way the body had fallen, the blood spreading across the concrete floor. And underneath it all, a question he couldn't answer. Had he pulled that trigger to protect Bumpy's organization, or had he pulled it to protect himself from Bumpy's suspicion? Had it been loyalty or self-preservation, duty or fear? The answer mattered, because it determined who Ghost Williams really was, a loyal soldier, or just another killer wearing loyalty like a mask. He fell asleep in the chair around dawn, and when he woke 3 hours later, there was a note from Maya on the coffee table. "Went to school, love you anyway." Those 3 words, "love you anyway," broke something in Ghost that the murder hadn't touched. His daughter loved him despite knowing, or at least suspecting, what he'd become. And that unconditional love felt more undeserved than any punishment Bumpy could have given him. Ghost went to the bathroom, splashed water on his face and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked older than his 41 years, harder than Ghost remembered being, emptier than anyone should feel after surviving another day in Harlem's underworld. But he also looked necessary, and in Bumpy Johnson's world, necessary was the only kind of good that mattered. The phone rang. Ghost picked it up. "It's done?" Bumpy's voice, calm as always. "It's done." "Good. Come to the office. We need to talk about what happens next." Bumpy Johnson's office was a small room above a dry cleaner on 135th Street. Unassuming, deliberately modest, the kind of place that wouldn't attract attention. But inside, it was where the real power of Harlem was concentrated. Decisions made in that room affected thousands of lives, controlled millions of dollars, determined who lived and who died. Ghost arrived at noon to find Bumpy sitting behind his desk, reading the New York Times with reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked more like a college professor than a crime boss, which was exactly how Bumpy had survived so long. Nobody expected sophistication from a black gangster, which made Bumpy's intelligence his most dangerous weapon. "Sit," Bumpy said without looking up from the paper. Ghost sat in the chair across from the desk and waited. Bumpy finished whatever article he was reading, carefully folded the newspaper, removed his glasses, and finally looked at Ghost with those calculating eyes that missed nothing. "How are you feeling?" The question surprised Ghost. Bumpy wasn't known for emotional check-ins. "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." Ghost considered lying, then decided against it. Bumpy always knew when people were lying. "I feel like I killed my best friend to save my own skin." "Good. Good. If you felt nothing, you'd be a psychopath, and psychopaths are unreliable. If you felt righteous about it, you'd be dangerous because righteousness makes people stupid. But guilt? Guilt is useful. Guilt means you understand the weight of what you did, which means you won't do it lightly again. And if I can't live with the guilt?" Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "Then you leave. Walk away from all of this. I'll make sure you and Maya are protected, set you up somewhere clean, give you enough money to start over. But if you stay knowing that what happened last night might happen again. Because this is what we do, Ghost. We protect our world by eliminating threats to it. And sometimes those threats used to be friends." Ghost thought about Maya's note. "Love you anyway." He thought about the life he'd built in Harlem, the reputation he'd earned, the purpose he'd found protecting Bumpy, and, by extension, protecting the community Bumpy shielded from worse predators. I'm not leaving. Then we move forward, and the first step is dealing with the FBI's response. Bumpy pulled out a file folder and slid it across the desk. Ghost opened it to find surveillance photographs, FBI agents watching Bumpy's known locations, photographing his associates, documenting his movements. They've increased surveillance since Silk went dark, Bumpy said. They know something happened, but they don't know what. Right now they're hoping Silk just got cold feet and is hiding somewhere. But eventually they'll find the body, and when they do, they'll know we caught him. So what's the play? We give them someone else to focus on. Make them think Silk's death was connected to something bigger, something that doesn't lead back to us. Bumpy pulled out another photograph, this one showing a white man in his 50s, expensive suit, confident posture. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, Genovese family. He's been trying to expand into Harlem for months, and we've been pushing back. The FBI knows this. So we make it look like Silk's death was part of the mob war, not an internal execution. Exactly. We plant evidence linking Silk to negotiations with the Genovese family. We make it look like he was playing both sides, helping us fight the mob while secretly working with them. When the FBI finds his body in Genovese territory with evidence of mob connections, they'll assume the Italians killed him for betraying them. It was elegant misdirection, the kind of strategic thinking that had kept Bumpy ahead of law enforcement for 3 decades, but it required more work, more risk, more potential for things to go wrong. What do you need from me? I need you to plant the evidence. Silk's apartment needs to look like he was in contact with the Genovese family. Phone records, meeting notes, financial transactions. Make it convincing enough that the FBI believes it, but sloppy enough that it looks like Silk was trying to hide it and failed. When? Tonight. The FBI will search his apartment within 48 hours once they realize he's missing. We need everything in place before then. Ghost nodded. It meant breaking into Silk's apartment, going through his things, planting false evidence in a space where Ghost had spent countless hours over the years. It meant violating what was left of their friendship one more time. But it also meant protecting Bumpy, protecting the organization, protecting Harlem from the chaos that would follow if the truth came out. I'll handle it. One more thing. Bumpy's expression grew even more serious. Your daughter asked about Silk. Ghost went rigid. How do you know that? Because I know everything that happens in my organization, Ghost, including when one of my top people comes home smelling like gunpowder and his daughter asks questions. Maya is smart. Too smart. And smart children in our world become dangerous adults. Dangerous to themselves or dangerous to others. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to decide what kind of life you want for her. If you want her in this world, start teaching her how to survive in it. If you want her out of this world, start planning how to get her out before she's too deep to escape. But don't leave her in the middle, half knowing the truth, half protected from it. That's how good people get destroyed. Ghost thought about Maya's note, about her perceptiveness, about the way she'd looked at him when he came home last night. She was already too deep to pretend ignorance, but maybe not too deep to escape entirely. She's going to college, Ghost said firmly. Far from here. Different life, different world. Then you better start saving, because college isn't cheap, and this life doesn't come with a pension plan. They talked for another hour about logistics, about covering tracks, about managing the FBI's investigation. When Ghost finally left Bumpy's office, the sun was setting over Harlem, casting long shadows across streets where Ghost had lived his entire life. He walked past the corner where he and Silk used to sell newspapers as kids, past the basketball court where they'd played pickup games on summer evenings, past the church where they'd both been baptized, where Silk had married his wife, where Ghost had buried his son. Every block held memories that would now be forever tainted by what Ghost had done. Harlem would never look the same, because Ghost would never be able to walk these streets without seeing Silk's face, hearing that gunshot, feeling the weight of the trigger under his finger. But that was the price of loyalty in Bumpy Johnson's world. You didn't just sacrifice your enemies, you sacrificed your friends, your past, your innocence. You became the kind of person who could pull the trigger at point-blank range and walk away functional. Ghost arrived at Silk's apartment building around midnight. He'd been here 1,000 times, knew which stairs creaked, which windows stuck, where Silk kept his spare key. The familiarity made what he was about to do feel even more like violation. He let himself in using the spare key, moved through the darkened apartment like a ghost, and began the methodical work of creating a false history. Phone records showing calls to known Genovese associates, meeting notes discussing territorial divisions, financial records showing payments from mob-connected businesses, all of it carefully fabricated but credible enough to fool investigators who wanted to believe that Silk had been playing both sides. Ghost was finishing the last details when he heard a sound from the bedroom. He froze, hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "I know you're out there, Marcus." The voice made Ghost's blood run cold, because it was Silk's voice, coming from the bedroom, which was impossible because Silk was dead, dumped in Genovese territory hours ago, unless Ghost had missed, unless Silk had survived, unless everything was about to fall apart. Ghost moved toward the bedroom, gun drawn, mind racing through scenarios and solutions. If Silk was alive, everything changed. The body, the evidence, the story they'd constructed, all of it worthless. He pushed the bedroom door open, weapon raised, ready for whatever came next. The bedroom was empty except for a small cassette recorder sitting on the nightstand, its tape still spinning. Ghost approached it cautiously, gun still drawn, half expecting an ambush. He pressed stop, then rewind, then play. Silk's voice filled the room. "I know you're out there, Marcus, and if you're hearing this, it means I'm probably dead. Means you're the one who killed me, or you're helping cover it up. Either way, I need you to hear something before this is over." There was a pause, the sound of Silk taking a deep breath, steadying himself. "I didn't betray Bumpy for money or witness protection. That was a lie. I betrayed him because I couldn't watch what we were becoming anymore. We started out protecting Harlem from the mob, from corrupt cops, from people who wanted to exploit our community. But somewhere along the way, we became exactly what we were fighting against. We're extracting money from poor people through numbers rackets. We're killing anyone who challenges us. We're corrupting the same institutions we claim to be protecting people from." Ghost felt sick, because Silk was right. Everything he was saying was true, even if Ghost had spent years refusing to see it. "I know what you're thinking," Silk's voice continued. "You're thinking I'm justifying betrayal, making excuses, trying to claim moral high ground I don't deserve. And maybe you're right. But Marcus, brother, when was the last time you looked at what we do and felt good about it? When was the last time you went home to Maya and didn't feel like you were dragging darkness into her life?" The recording paused again. When Silk's voice returned, it was thick with emotion. "I wore that wire because I thought if the FBI took down Bumpy, someone better might fill the vacuum. Someone who actually cared about Harlem instead of just controlling it. I was wrong about that. I see that now. The FBI doesn't care about us any more than Bumpy does. They just want to make arrests and advance careers. And whoever replaces Bumpy will probably be worse, not better." Ghost heard Silk moving around on the recording, ice clinking in a glass. Probably whiskey, Silk's drink of choice when things got heavy. "So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to warn you before the hit happens. I'm going to come to your house, talk to Maya, hope that you'll understand what I'm trying to say without me having to say it out loud. And if that doesn't work, if you still go through with it, then I'm going to accept it, because I betrayed the code, and the code demands payment." The recording went quiet except for breathing. "But I need you to know something, Marcus. I need you to know that I understand why you're doing it. You're protecting your daughter, protecting your position, protecting the only world you know how to navigate. I don't blame you for that. I just hope that someday you'll see what I saw, that this life we're living isn't protection, it's prison. And we're both the guards and the inmates." There was a click, then silence. The recording was over. Ghost stood in that bedroom for a long time, holding the cassette recorder, feeling the weight of Silk's final message. His friend had known he was about to die, had come to Ghost's house not to run, not to beg for help, but to give Ghost one last chance to see the truth. And Ghost had killed him anyway. The rational part of Ghost's mind knew that the recording changed nothing. Silk had still betrayed the organization. The hit had still been necessary. The evidence still needed to be planted to protect Bumpy and everyone who depended on him. But the emotional part, the part that remembered 32 years of friendship, that remembered Silk holding Maya when she was born, that remembered all the times they'd saved each other's lives, that part was screaming that Ghost had just made the worst mistake of his life. Ghost pocketed the cassette recorder. He'd destroy it later, erase the last trace of Silk's voice, eliminate the evidence of Ghost's guilt. But for now, he needed to finish the job he'd been sent to do. He completed the evidence planting, made sure everything looked authentic but discoverable, and left Silk's apartment the same way he'd entered, silently, invisibly, like the ghost his nickname implied. The walk home took twice as long as usual, because Ghost kept stopping, kept replaying Silk's words in his head, kept questioning everything he'd built his identity around for 20 years. Was Silk right? Had they become exactly what they'd been fighting against? Were they protecting Harlem or just controlling it for their own benefit? Ghost didn't have answers, but he had a daughter who deserved better than a father who executed his friends in warehouses. He had a community that deserved better than gangsters pretending to be saviors. He had a life that deserved examination, instead of just blind loyalty to a code that demanded murder. When he got home, Maya was already asleep. Ghost stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, thinking about the future she deserved versus the future he was creating for her. Then he went to his bedroom, pulled out the cassette recorder, and listened to Silk's message 3 more times. Each time it cut deeper. Each time the questions got louder. Each time Ghost felt more certain that something fundamental had to change. But change in Bumpy Johnson's world didn't come easy. Change meant risk. Change meant potentially losing everything Ghost had spent decades building. Change meant admitting that Silk might have been right, that the betrayal might have been justified, that the execution might have been murder instead of necessary enforcement of the code. Ghost ejected the cassette, held it over a trash can, ready to destroy the evidence of his crisis of conscience. His finger was on the button that would pull the tape out and ruin it forever. He couldn't do it. Instead, he hid the cassette in a box in his closet, behind old photographs and forgotten memories. Someday, maybe he'd be ready to destroy it. Or maybe someday he'd be ready to listen to what Silk was really saying. But not tonight. Tonight, Ghost was still Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard, still committed to the code, still the man who'd pulled the trigger at point-blank range and walked away functional. Tomorrow, though. Tomorrow might be different. The phone rang at 6 a.m. Ghost, who hadn't really slept, picked it up on the first ring. "They found the body," Bumpy's voice said, "and they found the evidence. The FBI thinks the mob killed him. It's working." "Good," Ghost said, his voice hollow. "You sound tired." "I am tired, Bumpy. I'm very tired." There was a pause. Then Bumpy said something that surprised Ghost. "When this settles down, take a vacation. You and Maya, get out of the city for a while. Clear your head. Since when do you care about my mental health? Since your mental health affects your reliability, and I need you reliable, Ghost, especially now with the FBI sniffing around and the mob trying to expand into Harlem. I need you sharp, not haunted." "What if I can't stop being haunted?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then you figure out how to live with ghosts, Marcus, because they never really leave. They just become part of who you are. Bumpy hung up. Ghost sat in the darkness, thinking about what Bumpy had just said, about living with ghosts, about Silk's voice on that cassette, about the sound of the gunshot that had changed everything. That sound, the one that had echoed through the warehouse, through Ghost's life, through Harlem's history, hadn't just killed Jerome Silk Patterson. It had killed something in Ghost, too. The part that believed in simple loyalty, in clear right and wrong, in the code that had governed his life for 2 decades. What remained was something more complicated, more troubled, more human. A man who'd pulled the trigger because he had to, who'd killed his friend because the alternative was worse, who'd enforced the code while beginning to question whether the code was worth enforcing. And that sound, that gunshot, that moment of decision, it would echo through the rest of Ghost's life, a reminder that in Bumpy Johnson's world, loyalty demanded everything, even the things you couldn't afford to lose, especially those things